As a guest on radio talk shows, I have on a number of occasions criticized U.S. foreign policy, and one time an irate caller called in and he said to me, "Do you love your country?" And the question was obviously rhetorical, because here was someone who saw fit to question my patriotism because I was questioning the policies of our leaders. It's really strange when you think about it. The caller was manifesting a symptom of what might be called superpatriotism, also sometimes called stupor-patriotism, also called pseudo-patriotism, a phenomenon best defined as the willingness to follow our leaders uncritically in all their dealings with other nations, especially when those dealings are confrontational and belligerent and they involve a question of national pride or the use of military force. That's the definition of superpatriotism. This superpatriotism or American chauvinism has been with us throughout much of our history. And whether or not it's the last refuge of scoundrels, as Dr. Johnson would say, it certainly is a very effective instrument in discouraging and discrediting critical public discourse. Well, I think it's time that the superpatriots account for their brand of patriotism. It has explained to us what it's all about. For instance, what do they mean when they say they love their country? What do they mean by country? You know, academia is not totally without certain virtues. You learn to ask a lot of trivial, detailed questions in any case. So I asked myself, what do you mean by country? Do they love every region and locale in the United States? Well, obviously, very few of us have been to every region and locale, and nor would all of us find all the regions and locales all that lovable. Does love of country mean loving the American people? Well, again, even the most gregarious among us have met only a relatively small portion of the American people. And I would bet that the superpatriots don't particularly love whole sectors of the American public, especially the more bigoted superpatriots. In fact, rather dislike to associate with or have any positive identification with certain people because of reasons of ethnicity, religion, race, and class. Do superpatriots love America for its history and culture? Again, I'm really skeptical of that because it's my impression that they know very little about American history and culture, or rather, much of it is rather unappreciated by them. Furthermore, there's a terrible side to our history that's really not all that lovable. For instance, the extermination of Native American Indian nations, the enslavement of African people, the aggressive wars against Vietnam, Mexico, Canada. We lost 1,000 men on one attack on Canada. I just learned a little while ago. Central America, the Philippines, and elsewhere. Nor might we all be that enamored with certain aspects of American culture. Certainly not the mind abuse of primetime television, the commercialism, the corporate greed, the ecological devastation, the economic and racial injustice. If I'm being asked to prove my patriotism by loving American popular culture, then I might fail the test, I guess. The America that the superpatriots claim to love is neither a geographical totality, nor is it a vast population, nor is it really a history or culture. Their America, and they say love America, is an ideological abstraction. It's an emotive symbol that can be embodied in other abstract symbols like the flag. It's sort of almost a love without content. I mean, how else can you love a flag? I mean, a flag, as you know, is a piece of rag on a stick. And it's got colors and things. And if you love that flag, and that flag's a symbol of your country, it's a kind of love that doesn't seem to have a content to it. Well, having said that, let me contradict myself. Because there is one real content to the superpatriotism. Its main substance is militarism. The pacifist and activist Milford Sibley, he once noted, quote, "Patriotism for most professional patriots seems to be inseparably connected with military violence and war." Indeed, the most militaristic among us seem to think that they are the most patriotic. Isn't that rather extraordinary? Patriotic virtues are equated with military ones. Our history's patriotic vignettes are usually military ones. Valley Forge, the Alamo, Gettysburg, the battleship Maine, Pearl Harbor, raising the flag on Iwo Jima, D-Day, the MIAs and POWs, and the like. Our country, right or wrong, but mostly our country at war or ready for war. The commemorations of our national leaders during national holidays would be incomplete without the marching troops, the weapon displays, martial music, formations of fighter planes zooming overhead. Even in local communities, when they organize patriotic celebrations, the marching bands usually appear in semi-martial uniforms, the high school cadets with rifles on their shoulders, and if there's an army base nearby, even troops. I remember once sitting in Urbana, Illinois, July 4th, watching this parade come by, and on this float was suddenly this missile, sort of small missile, but there was this instrument of death on this float that was going by, and there were some people around me, and you know what they did? They started to applaud this inanimate object. I mean, there wasn't even a pilot or, somebody else tending to it, or a soldier striding it and waving and going, yow, look at me, it was too much for me, and they were just applauding this weapon. And a little jet fighter came by on the float, and they started applauding that too. This was at a time when these things were being used in Vietnam. Well, even July 4th fireworks sometimes are really a benign representation or replication of the rockets, red glare, the bombs bursting in air. Max Weber once said that the state's irreducible characteristic is a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. And to be sure, state ceremonies in most states include some display of military force. Now, the way superpatriots express their national pride leaves me uncomfortable. It seems the love we are to have for our country rests on some kind of competition with other countries, that it comes at an expense with other countries. It's a love that is predicated on some invidious comparison to other countries being lesser, being not as good. If we love our country, we have to believe it's better than any other. The superpatriots will even ask us, don't you think this is the best country in the world? So that you love it because it's better. It's something better. This, by the way, we might recognize immediately as the being number one syndrome. I guess I must have heard about being number one for a long time, but the first time it ever stuck in my mind was when I heard President Richard Nixon, sometime in the late 60s, announce, and I quote, "America is still number one." And the still, of course, hints at some anxiety that there might be some slippage there. So I'm listening to this and I'm saying, okay, number one. Number one. That makes me feel, like number one, and that's pretty good. But I was bothered by it because it presumed that we were in some kind of adversarial relationship to other nations, all other countries, and that somehow our greatness and our goodness could only be measured in comparison to them, only in our ability to be the top banana. So I said, all right, we're number one. And then one of those troublesome questions came again in my head. And I said, if we're number one, what are we number one in? I mean, what are you number one in? So I said, population? And then, no, the Chinese walk away with all the awards in that category. Geography? No, I think the Soviets and even Canada has more real estate than we do. We're not number one in size. I think Brazil, there's a number of countries, I think. I don't even want to think about it, about all the countries that might be ahead of us there. Steel production and other basic industries? I perked up a little. Well, we used to be number one in that, but we have slipped down the list because our super patriot corporate leaders have taken to abandoning our communities and exporting our jobs and bringing the factories off to Taiwan and Argentina and South Korea, where they can work for slave labor wages. Which, when you think about it, is not the way for super patriots to act, really, take our factories away and all that. So I said, well, what are we number one? Are we number one in cuisine? Please. I mean, in that category, we are strictly double digits. way behind, France, China, Japan, Mexico, Italy, India, Greece, and others. Are we number one in trade? I know we used to be number one in trade, but I believe the Japanese have outstripped us, or so it would seem to anybody who's walked into any department store in the last couple of years. So the question remains, I was sitting there saying, well, what are we number one in? And the best I can tell from the super-patriotic utterances is that it gets down to two things. One, wealth, with no concern as to how the wealth is distributed and how it's used and for what effects, and military power, with no concern again with how that military power is used and for whose interests that it might serve at home and abroad. Now, supposedly we can love America and be proud of our country because it's so great. The implication is, however, that if it weren't so great, it wouldn't be so lovable. And that began to trouble me. The super-patriot's love of country seems predicated on the country's being up there, stronger and superior to other countries. What happens if it's going to slip? What happens? I started thinking, really, what about people from lesser lands, as we might call them? What about somebody from Luxembourg? Now Luxembourg is number 122, just barely ahead of San Marino in its military might. I said, what does someone from Luxembourg do? Do they go around shamefaced like this, You say, you from Luxembourg? You from Luxembourg? I say, no, I'm French. No, I'm French. And you say, do you love your country? They say, well, what is there to love? A few border police, no army, no navy. It's what's so important about being number one? Well, what the hell does it mean to be number one anyway? This preoccupation with being number one strikes me, ladies and gentlemen, as I say, as a sign of weakness, not of strength. As a sign of insecurity, not of security. People who know who they are don't worry about being number one. People who are in touch with the deeper values of social justice and democracy don't get a number one thrill from stomping on a tiny nation. People who seek friendship and cooperation with other peoples don't need to lord it over other nations and outshine them. Such a people don't have to find reassurances in themselves by looking at or imagining the deficiencies of others. And they don't feel threatened by the accomplishments and strengths of other people. Contrast, the super-patriots are the real patriots. We who, for instance, don't want to see the good name of our nation sullied. Real patriots love their country enough to want to improve it, and their patriotism has a social content, and that social content is social justice. Real patriots do things the American way, the democratic way, not with secret crypto-fascist coteries in the national security state, but with open debate and open challenges against privileged interests. Real patriots know that democracy is not just the ability to hold elections, but to serve and fulfill the basic needs and interests of the demos, the people. Real patriots are also internationalists. They may love and feel attached to their country, but they also love the peoples of all countries, all being different representations of the human family. Real patriots educate themselves about the real history of their country, and they're not satisfied with the flag-waving promo stuff. They want a people's history as written by people like Philip Foner, Eric Foner, Boyers and Maraes, Herbert Aptheker, and Howard Zinn. Real patriots find different things in our history to be proud of than the super-patriots do. We're proud of things like the struggle for the enfranchisement, the abolitionist movement, the peace movement, the abolition of child labor, the struggle for collective bargaining, the extension of universal suffrage to people of color and to women, the struggle for racial justice, the 8-hour day, occupational safety, the struggle for gender equality. In the Real Patriots pantheon can be found Tom Paine, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, Mark Twain, Susan B. Anthony, Big Bill Haywood, John Reed, Eugene Victor Debs, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, William Z. Foster, A.J. Musty, Harry Bridges, Martin Luther King, and not just those notables, but the thousands and the tens of thousands and the millions of people in the ranks who fought all those struggles, who raised up those leaders, who brought up those leaders, brought them forth and made them national and political realities.